Please make an extraordinary amount of noise for Dr. Emily Grossman. Morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for inviting me to be here and to speak with you. Just tell you a little bit about myself. So as you heard, I'm a science communicator, but I'm also here in my capacity as an Extinction Rebellion protester and as one of the co-founders and spokespeople for Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. So Scientists for Extinction Rebellion are an international group that has grown massively in just a very few short months. Our role is to bring scientists together, to bring together the scientific knowledge and awareness about the urgency of the climate and ecological situation, and also to bring together experts in climate science, ecology, land, fossil fuels, land use, biodiversity, to bring them together to have a voice, to explain the catastrophic situation we find ourselves in, and to actually lend support for those like yourselves who are taking non-violent direct action to protest against government inaction over the climate and ecological emergency. Scientists for Extinction Rebellion now have the support from nearly 1,500 scientists across the globe from over 20 different countries who have signed what we've called the Scientist Declaration. And in this declaration, not only do we set out the current situation, the current consensus from peer-reviewed evidence from scientific studies across the globe to say that yes, global warming is happening, yes, we have caused this, yes, we are heading towards catastrophic and irreversible effects on our planet, on our life, on our ecosystems, on our extreme weather, on what's going to happen to our land, and that we are heading towards this faster and faster, that global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, that carbon dioxide gas emissions continue to rise exponentially in spite of what we are being told, and that we have to act now, urgently, to begin to bring these greenhouse gas emissions down to zero, to net zero, not by 2050, but as fast as humanly possible, in fact faster, in order to prevent catastrophic and irreversible changes to our climate that are going to result in devastating impacts on our planet and incalculable suffering and loss of life. And in this scientist declaration, like I said, that's been signed by 1,500 and counting, going up every day, scientists across the globe, we also state as a community that the climate science community, the biodiversity science community, have been raising the alarm about the devastating effects of human-caused global warming for over 40 years. And nothing has been done. I say nothing because, yes, there are people out there who say, oh, Parliament has declared a climate emergency, but nothing is actually happening. We now have a moral obligation to humanity, knowing the truth that we now know, to actually come out onto the streets and take action to stop the governments. And for those who can't take that action, they are supporting those of us who can. So these signatures growing every day, 1,500 so far, at least half of whom come from top climate scientists, people who've dedicated their lives to researching the facts and figures around the climate ecological emergency, are now saying that we want to support people like you who are taking action that is now at times going beyond the bounds of the law. Now this is extraordinary. This is extraordinary for scientists to be taking this step. And I'm here just to represent those many, many voices who are now joining together. You might have seen us, some of us, at the rebellion in London over the past 2 weeks. You might have seen us lying down in the road in the financial district, being carried away by the police, protesting outside BlackRock, one of the main financial institutions in the city. You might have seen us protesting outside the Science Museum, one of the most important science institutions in the country, to draw attention to the fossil fuel crisis and to the fact that there are many big organisations that are still hands tied, having their sponsorship and their funding through fossil fuel companies. But the reason that I stand here today as a representative of this community is because we know that in order to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, we are currently heading towards 4 degrees warming by the end of the century, which is going to be absolutely devastating. Top climate scientists have said that in a 4-degree world, because of the impacts on rising sea levels, on extreme weather, on crop failures, on lack of clean water to drink, on air pollution, on loss of species, loss of pollinators, loss of the creatures we all depend on for our food, for our water, for our food systems that depend on the smallest creatures to pollinate the crops. Because of all of this, top climate scientists have said that they can't see how a 4-degree world, which is where we're heading right now by the end of the century, could be compatible with life of more than, say, 1 billion people. We are heading towards a population of around 9 billion by that time. This population loss is predicted to be caused not necessarily directly, all of that, but by the knock-on effects of what climate change and biodiversity loss will do to our system, to our financial systems, to our social systems, the knock-on effect of what hikes in food prices due to crop failures abroad will have on our markets. Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, said that by the time we reach financial instability, it will be too late. The impacts of our loss of crops, loss of... Now, in order to prevent this, it has been categorically shown, according to the Paris Agreement, that we need to stay beneath 1.5 degrees warming. The IPCC states that in order for us to have even a 50% chance of staying beneath 1.5 degree warming, we have to get to carbon zero by 2050. However, firstly, this is only a 50% chance. Do you want to gamble on that? No. Secondly, these facts and figures are based, people say, we shouldn't trust the IPCC. That's not true. The IPCC is solid, peer-reviewed science. However, necessarily, it is based on climate prediction models which are being proved day on day to have underestimated the severity of what's going on. This is not because climate scientists don't know what they're doing, quite the opposite. It's because these are predictions of a situation that is inherently unstable, that is getting worse and worse, where we are entering tipping points and feedback loops that simply we don't have the technology to be able to predict. And all the predictions that have been made so far have come true and in fact are far worse. We are seeing rates of ice melting, of warming, of permafrost, release of greenhouse gases from permafrost, of feedback loops in the Arctic, more and faster than any of these climate models have predicted. And these are the models that the predictions of how fast we need to get to net zero are based on. Also, the speed at which we need to get to net zero is based on a global situation. Here in the UK, we need to do it much faster, partly because of historical responsibility of the fact that we started this back in the Industrial Revolution. Most of the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that stay there for up to 100 years are caused by us from the Industrial Revolution, which was a brilliant thing that we did for the world, but now we have to take responsibility for it. And also because of what's called carbon equity, which means that we are still producing such a high proportion of the carbon emissions, that in order globally for us to get to net zero by 2050, even if that were enough, which it's not, even if that were enough for us to get there globally, we need to get there much, much faster. Otherwise, we're leaving no carbon to be emitted by developing countries, and that's simply impossible. So, even if 2050 were enough, we're not doing nearly enough. But 2050 isn't enough. The studies that our 2050 are based on anyway are based on there being some overshoot, some carbon emissions that can shoot over the global budget that brings us beneath 1.5. And then we're relying on what's called negative emission technologies, carbon capture and storage, for example, to suck those emissions back in after 2050. All the good evidence and data shows that those carbon capture and storage technologies are simply not going to be good enough to do that. We're not in a position to rely on that. Negative emission technologies are hopefully something that will evolve and develop, but we're not there, and we simply cannot rely on something that doesn't exist. That is all based on the assumption that 2050 is enough, which it's not. Because of everything that I've shared, we are now saying that we have to get to carbon zero much, much faster, particularly here in the UK. Now, you might hear people saying, skeptics saying, oh, but the UK's doing well. Firstly, we only emit 1.5% of the carbon budget globally, and secondly, we're bringing our emissions down. Now, I'm going to tell you, for any skeptics in your life, for anyone you come across, I'm going to tell you why these two things are not true. First of all, this 1.5%, yes, on our territory, we emit 1.5% of the global carbon budget. Firstly, that's twice as much as we should be doing per head, because we only actually have 0.8% of the population. But more importantly, is that our greenhouse gas emissions are mostly, firstly, invested in by the City of London. 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions are through investments through city banks that are offshore. So they don't count in this 1.5%. Secondly, this 1.5% doesn't include greenhouse gas emissions embedded in our consumerist culture through the food and the products that we import, that we eat, that we use, that we buy, fast fashion. All of that are called embedded carbon emissions, and they come from fossil fuels from countries abroad. They don't count in what we claim to be, according to the government, our carbon emissions. And thirdly, we are also, according to a recent study, of all the G7 countries, we are the biggest importers. That's what I was saying. We're the biggest importers now out of all the G7 countries of our carbon emissions through what we consume. But another point is that we actually invest directly billions of pounds a year in fossil fuel subsidies for factories and power stations overseas, mostly in low to middle income countries, more than any other country in the EU. So those are the reasons why this 1.5% figure is complete nonsense. The reason why people saying that we're bringing our greenhouse gas emissions down is also nonsense, even with this 1.5%, is first of all because partly that's been the transition from coal to oil and natural gas, which are still not okay, but better than coal was. That's partly why our emissions have gone down, but they won't continue to go down, because that's a transitional blip. Secondly, all of the measures that the government have promised to take in order to bring our territorial emissions down, out of the 24 measures that they promised to take, when an internal governmental review called the CCC, the Committee for Climate Change, went into the government in July and looked at their policies, they found that only out of 24 policies that they'd put in place to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in this country, only 7 were currently being looked at or met. Only 7 out of 24 of the ones that initially, in the initial view, were said had to happen immediately. That is what they're doing with this lip service, climate emergency that's been talked about by Parliament and hasn't actually been passed by government anyway. So that brings me to why you, I, we, and everyone watching or listening on the live streams are here today, which is to protest against even further potential territorial greenhouse gas emissions from drilling for oil here at the Horse Hill site in Surrey. Now, we're all here because we know that the plans are to release more oil reserves from these sites over the next 20-25 years. And this directly contravenes, goes against everything that we need to do on this planet in the UK right now to prevent catastrophe. According to over 99%, I should say, not all, but 99% of climate scientists and ecological scientists across the globe are saying this, well, they're not saying this directly, but they know that this kind of work will directly contravene what needs to be done to prevent disaster. Now, not only that, but if we begin to burn even more fossil fuels, we're going to get worse, as opposed to helping things to get better. Yes, there's arguments to say that, we're going to have to heat our homes, we're going to need fossil fuels, but, we have fossil fuels, and what we need to be doing is getting to a warlike mobility, warlike mobilization of our society in order to cut now, not move towards even 2025, 2030, certainly not 2050, but cut now and change things radically, systemically and structurally. Yes. So supporting schemes like this is just it's a crime. It's a crime against humanity to say that this can happen and that this can be okay. And not only that, just to put this in a slightly different context, in 2014, the Governor of the Bank of England, this was 5 years ago, before we even got to the Paris Agreement, the Governor of the Bank of England said that if we're going to stay beneath 2 degrees warming, which the Paris Agreement says we now need to stay beneath 1.5, which is even more severe, if we're going to stay beneath 2 degrees warming, that the majority of our already known coal and oil and gas reserves have to stay in the ground. So what is the point for drilling if they have to stay in the ground? He said they have to stay in the ground or they're going to lead to stranded assets, carbon assets, that are worth nothing because they can't be used. Aside from the travesty in terms of our humanity and our suffering that's going to ensue because of climate change and because of ecological collapse, this is going to lead to collapse of our financial systems, which will lead to even more suffering because people won't have money. The banks will collapse, the finance systems will collapse. This is a very real issue that is separate and parallel and related to the very more direct issues that will impact from flooding, from heat waves, from droughts, from loss of food, from loss of crops, and from the direct impacts of ecological collapse. So I'm going to finish up speaking now, but I just want to say on behalf of our 1,500 scientists across the globe, on behalf of our team of scientists called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, who have our own Facebook group, an outward-facing Facebook page, come and find us. We have a handle on Twitter, @ScientistsX, @ScientistsX. I am one of the spokespeople. You can find me on Twitter @Dr. Emily Grossman, or on Facebook, Emily Grossman. There are lots of other wonderful and amazing speakers and scientists in our community who you can get in touch with, who I can put you in touch with if you want to talk to people within our community. So please do get in touch. But on behalf of all of them, and on behalf of everyone else in Extinction Rebellion, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a stand. Thank you for using your voices. Thank you for using your feet and being here to say this can't happen. This is direct hypocrisy, and this is a travesty. This is a crime against humanity, against the lives of us, against the lives of our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was a fantastic speech. Thank you so much.